And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This essay explores the quiet, cumulative erosion of the self within systems that reward visibility, clarity, and emotional legibility. Rather than a critique of platforms or technology, it is an inquiry into what happens to subjectivity when identity becomes performance by default and presence is shaped by the rhythms of interface design. It draws from sociology, philosophy, trauma studies, and narrative theory to trace how digital life demands a self that is simplified, formatted, and rendered scalable. And in that demand, certain parts of interior life, slowness, contradiction, ambiguity, breath, become harder to preserve. It is an act of narrative care, holding space for the parts of selfhood that remain unrendered, uncaptioned, and alive in ways that resist performance. You do not find yourself online. You are formed there. Each gesture, each sentence, each image builds a version of you designed not to be known, but to be seen. The screen doesn't ask who you are. It asks what you can become through it. So you learn to become legible. You post not to reveal, but to remain. Not to communicate, but to not disappear. The algorithm does not demand truth. It demands frictionless familiarity, an offering that scans, renders, circulates. You feel this pressure not as command, but as rhythm, and soon rhythm becomes reflex. There was a time when you had parts of yourself that no one saw. Not secrets, just pieces that didn't require interpretation. Now, even your quiet moments arrive preloaded with the question, how will this play? You no longer look at a sunset and feel. You look at a sunset and pre-narrate. You adjust your mood to the optics. You soften grief into something captionable. The backstage Goffman once spoke of is gone. The Foucaultian gaze has fragmented, no longer a central authority, but a soft omnipresence built into the structure of everyday participation. The ghost of being perceived is now ambient. This isn't surveillance in the traditional sense. It's something more atmospheric. As Byung-Chul Han argues, of violence of transparency, exposure mistaken for intimacy. You offer pieces of yourself not to be understood, but to be maintained. You shape your own edges to fit someone else's scrolling. The performance is constant, but what's performed becomes unclear. You're no longer managing impressions. You're managing erosion, not lying, just repeating until the truth becomes a format. And yet some things resist formatting. A moment stutters. A sentence won't land, a feeling won't shrink. These disruptions are where the Winnicottian self begins to speak, the one that only survives where there is no audience. Not because it's fragile, but because it cannot be reduced. You begin to remember this self, not through memory, but through ache, a kind of soreness that arises when a part of you hasn't moved freely in too long. It's not rebellion, it's a pause, a refusal to narrate, a silence that isn't absence but shelter. You post nothing, you feel no shape in the moment, but something is happening, a slow recovery of rhythm, not the platform's rhythm, but your own, slower, unmarketable. Unguarded, the self begins again, not to express, but to remain unrendered, not to disappear, but to endure in forms too soft for feed logic, a moment that slips through every frame and still speaks, uncaptioned, still yours. You scroll not to see, but to stay in motion. The feed becomes a kind of gravity, not a source of insight, but a buffer against stillness. You move through it as one might move through a hallway in a dream, vaguely aware, vaguely unsettled, always pulled forward. It does not ask you to remember, it asks you to keep going. Each fragment offers the sensation of presence without the weight of attention. What Zuboff called behavioral surplus has become emotional debris. 1,000 unnoticed gestures drifting past your awareness, each one leaving behind a subtle shape you can't name. This is not distraction. It is architecture. The interface is not a portal. It is a form of life. And life inside it follows different physics. Time collapses, continuity dissolves, feeling is formatted before it is felt. You learn to express before you experience, to stylize sadness before it has time to ache. Berlant might have called this preemptive mourning, the need to soften the grief before it threatens coherence. What once lived in silence is now curated in public, just loud enough to scan but never deep enough to disrupt. The sociology of this is quiet but exacting. As Hochschild wrote of emotional labour, you perform feeling to meet expectations. But here the expectation is ambient. It is shaped not by a manager or an institution, but by rhythm, reward, reply. You feel an urge to document your joy the moment it peaks, not because you want to share it, but because not sharing feels like waste. The interface trains you to see moments as material, not memory, but something resists, not loudly, just enough to notice. A sentence you begin to post, then delete. A moment you choose to keep. The ache you let sit unsolved. These aren't acts of privacy, they are acts of recovery. What Federici calls the reclamation of the body from systems that script it into output. They are reminders that not everything you feel needs to be explained, that not every thought needs an audience to be real. You begin to feel the difference between visibility and recognition, between exposure and presence. You start to imagine a self that doesn't need to be processed to matter, a self that lives in the flicker between frames. You remember something Winnicott insisted on, that the truest parts of us emerge only when no one is watching, not because they are hidden, but because they are unbranded. And so you let the feed continue without you. Just for a moment, you don't scroll, you don't post, you sit in the ache of something unrendered, not to turn it into insight, just to let it live. There's a fatigue that doesn't announce itself as tiredness. It moves differently, quieter, deeper, more cumulative. It's the tiredness of constant interpretation, of becoming legible before you've even figured out what you feel, of offering yourself in parts formatted for scanning, not knowing. You begin to recognize it not in your body, but in your sentence structure, in how often you start with I think instead of I feel, in how often you pivot mid-thought to preempt misunderstanding, in how often you compress. This is the tiredness Byung-Chul Han calls psychic auto-exploitation. The pressure isn't external, it's internalized. You drive yourself to clarity not for truth but for traction. Every sentence becomes a performance of cohesion. Even your ambiguity is curated. You doubt performatively. You ache within quotation marks. And slowly, the original feeling begins to hollow. Bateson's double bind theory lingers here. Be authentic, but also make sure you're understood. Be vulnerable, but only in ways that won't alienate. Be complex, but in language that performs simplicity. These aren't rules, they're architectures. You don't resist them because you barely notice them until you stop. And silence feels unfamiliar, but silence isn't absence. It's a shift in grammar, a reintroduction of ambiguity. In that quiet, you begin to notice what doesn't scale. You remember the feeling of holding a thought privately, not because it's a secret, but because it has no interface. You feel it in your hands, in your pacing, in your syntax. The sentence doesn't rush. The self doesn't collapse into a paragraph. This is where Laurent Ballant's loop returns, not as repetition, but as return with difference. You're still online, still reachable, but something in you no longer bends as easily. You let the ache take its time. You let the memory stutter. You don't trim the contradiction. You walk beside it. And in that walk, you hear something, not a truth, a texture. Something like Lord's erotic, power not in exposure, but in the refusal to flatten, something that thuds quietly in the chest, not because it is profound, but because it is whole. You realize not everything you feel belongs to the feed. Some things are still yours, unnamed, undigested, alive. So you carry them, not as content, but as rhythm. A breath unshared, a sentence unfinished, a feeling too wide for formatting. You don't explain. You stay, not to be seen, but to be. There's a dissonance that grows when everything becomes narratable. You feel something raw, grief, longing, confusion, and before it even settles, you're shaping it into something readable. Not because you're dishonest, but because you've learned to survive through formatting. You write the caption before you cry. You imagine the reply before you speak. And in doing so, the moment becomes smaller than it was. It becomes legible, but not true. Judith Butler taught us that identity is not discovered, it is reiterated. But in this space, the reiteration becomes compression. The version of you that survives online is the version that explains the one that can collapse ambivalence into a sentence with rhythm. Even your uncertainties become stylized. Even your pauses are punctuated for effect, and something in that loop begins to wear through. This isn't about dishonesty, it's about legibility as discipline. Foucault's gaze no longer needs a watcher, it has become reflex. A feeling that doesn't render becomes suspect, a silence that stretches becomes tension. You learn not to hold anything too long in case it becomes misunderstood. So you translate everything until there's nothing left that hasn't already been passed. But there are still fragments that resist, not loud ones, the small ones, a gesture you don't post, a thought you don't refine, a sadness you let remain unnamed. These aren't refusals, they're recoveries, acts of small defiance against the tyranny of coherence, acts of presence that don't scale. They echo what Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation, the telling of what cannot be told cleanly, the living with what does not resolve. They refuse the need for a smooth arc. They stay jagged, not to provoke but to remain real. And in their unevenness, they return you to something softer, something not built for display. This is what Baldwin knew, that the work of staying human is not in being right or clear or understood, but in remaining intact through contradiction. That intimacy requires ambiguity, that love resists explanation, that being seen is not the same as being met. So you begin to leave space in your days, not for content, but for the moments that don't condense. The breath before the word, the hesitation that doesn't correct itself, the feeling that stirs but never quite lands. You do not need to name these, you only need to let them stay. Not everything needs a frame. Some things are most alive in their refusal to be shaped. You start to notice how often you've been speaking in a voice not entirely your own. Not false, just formatted. Rounded at the edges, softened for flow. The tone calibrated not for intimacy, but for readability, a voice made durable by exposure. You wonder when it happened, when expression became something shaped for response rather than offered for connection. You speak and listen for the echo, not the understanding. You phrase your ache so it doesn't land too heavily. You say what can be digested. But what of the things that refuse digestion, the thoughts that resist phrasing, the feelings that remain stubborn, strange, unshareable? There's a language that lives outside the scroll. It arrives slower. It disrupts tone. It is less a sentence than a presence. And when it comes, it often startles you. You forget you could still speak like that. This is the tension Mark Fisher pointed to, the space between knowing a system is eroding you and still not knowing how to leave. The interface teaches you to perform even your doubt. It turns reflection into output, stillness into inefficiency, privacy into a kind of silence that feels like irrelevance. But what if the silence isn't empty? What if it's spacious? Anne Carson wrote that some silences are full, not absences, but thresholds. You begin to feel them differently. Not as gaps in expression, but as expressions themselves. The silence after an unposted sentence, the breath before deciding not to explain. These aren't glitches, they're memory of how you once existed before formatting, of the time before legibility became survival. Christina Sharp called this wake work, living in the aftermath of something that hasn't ended. That's what this is too. A waking presence inside a structure that doesn't collapse but persists. The feed keeps going, the performances continue, but you begin to move differently within it. Not to exit, but to soften, to let some part of you remain untouched. You no longer ask how you're being seen. You begin to ask whether you're still seeing. You don't need to speak it all. You don't need to shape every truth into a sentence. You need only to be near it. To walk beside it without explanation, to feel it settle in your hands, uncaptioned, unfinished, and perhaps for now, that is enough. Not as retreat, but as rhythm, not as hiding, but as home. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.